Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very, very accomplished professional from the UK, Mr. Adam Kingl. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Adam is an author, a keynote speaker, an educator, and an advisor. He's an authority on generational paradigms in the workplace, the future of work and capitalism, and he's an author. And all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of 2 books, which are titled Next Generation Leadership and Sparking Success, and we'll talk about his books. So Adam, let's start by asking you a question. Tell me about your own journey in brief.
It certainly isn't a journey that I anticipated at the beginning. I think it reminds me of there's a Yiddish proverb, if you want to make God laugh, show him your plans. So I think my career definitely applies.
Okay.
I started actually in the arts. I was in the entertainment and media industry,
Wow.
both on the creative side, ultimately working my way into the business side. I then shifted wholly into business, did my MBA at London Business School. And then started working with companies on their leadership, creativity, their collaboration, their culture, and started expanding my industry focus. So I became more of a generalist than specifically just working with media and entertainment companies. I was in the leadership team at London Business School for almost 10 years, then Duke University's corporate education, and now I'm a faculty member for a couple of different institutions and doing my own thing.
Wonderful, wonderful. So when we stop recording, I'll talk to you about London Business School because my son did his MBA from London Business School.
Oh, brilliant.
But let me ask you that, you talk about generational paradigms in the workplace. Help me understand what this means, and if possible, give me an example.
Sure. Well, there's lots of literature out there on diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and that's all very important. But I think one lens that a lot of organizations ignore is age differences. So sometimes we think of age as, well, when were you born? And that's true, of course, but it's a little bit of a cheat because, of course, not every paradigm that you might apply to a given generation would apply to you individually. So I think it's more useful to think about what were the paradigms that existed when you grew up, because that will give you an indication of what you think about work, careers, life, leadership. It's not a substitute for getting to know people individually, which I think is a key responsibility of leaders. But organizations often fail to distinguish those paradigmatical differences among generations. In other words, they conflate what one generation wants out of their leaders, out of the organization, out of their mission with another generation. And that's when you get tension in the workplace about proper leadership. I'll give you one very quick example, work-life balance. Now, I think it's safe to say that there are different views about work-life balance, typically among different generations. I think on the whole, I'm exaggerating here, but on the whole, older generations still have a preference for being in the office. I think there's great value in terms of cultural cohesion for everyone to be in the office. Younger generations often couldn't care less, right? Want to be in the office as little as possible. This is the digital generation. So they grew up always being able to collaborate in a virtual environment. So they don't value the face-to-face interaction as much. But I think we also, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is we also, though, have to be very clear about how we're defining what we mean when we say work-life balance, because I've noticed that there are semantic differences among the generations around the phrase work-life balance. But that's a key area where we can start in thinking about how do we better manage the multi-generational workforce.
Very interesting. And when you talk generations, of course, there is, it's so neatly segmented by what I call the alphabet soup, Generation X, Generation Y, and now we've got the Gen Zs, and now I'm told the Alpha Gen has started. But when you look at the fresh perspectives that are being brought in by each successive generation, do you see any kind of a clash taking place in these generations in the workplace?
Well, there is a part of it represents, I think, the shift that's occurring in business around what is the point of business itself. The interesting thing about capitalism is it has a really great capacity to invent and reinvent itself. Capitalism has never been just one thing. And of course, it's already practiced very differently in different parts of the world. For example, Scandinavian capitalism is not practiced the same way as Anglo-Saxon capitalism. And I think you also see those kinds of differences among generations. So the youngest generation, I think, has a much stronger emphasis on purpose in work, on the wider, ESG responsibilities of business towards society and toward the world, not only shareholder value, not only Milton, Friedmanian maximize value for shareholders. And so there we're starting to see that there's a shift occurring, because initially that was simply tension. And people saying, well, you can't have that kind of a shift because the purpose of business is business. However, with every analyst and every pension fund manager and every regulator that is now, among Gen Y, who have a greater affinity toward the view that business has to serve a greater function than simply maximizing profits for shareholders, so too will the regulatory environment and the public sector start to enforce and support organizations that feel that they have a wider view to play in society than simply creating profits.
Wonderful response. Thank you. So, Adam, you're also, an authority on the future of work, and my next few questions will be on the future of work. Let me start by asking you, what are some of the trends that you see in the future of work as we move forward from 2023 and beyond?
Well, one I've talked about, which is this, the much greater emphasis on purpose. And Princeton University actually did a survey a few years ago, and they found that over 80% of young high potential graduates say the number one thing they're looking for in an employer is a strong lived sense of purpose. I think that's the word, the important word in that phrase is lived. So not only a good phrase, but can you find evidence of that actually manifesting? That's one. The other interesting thing is there's a shift in the future of work in terms of how people are defining a career. It used to be very three-stage, right? Education, career, retirement. But and the portfolio career was often something that you pursued as you were at or nearing retirement, where maybe you do some consulting and maybe you work part-time and maybe volunteer some time for a charity, etc. But that was something you did at the end of your career. Today, there are young people just entering the workforce who want their career to be that portfolio career from the very beginning. Now, that's very challenging for organizations then who are trying to recruit and retain full-time employee top talent. So those are two big shifts that I'm seeing.
But there's another aspect that I thought I'll ask you based on your response, and that is that with improved healthcare, the boomers, who are now in their early 60s probably, they'll probably live for another 30 years, which means that their life post-superannuation will be almost equal to their working life.
Right.
So if one was to relate it to generational paradigms, you've got young people, who are already wanting a portfolio type of work. The older people are already also looking for a portfolio type of work. How do you see this evolving, Adam?
Well, I just want to emphasize that point you made, that because boomers in their 60s and 70s actually aren't retiring, at the rate at which we thought.
Correct.
And that can be a value, right, for their employers who get to retain that wisdom and those knowledge economies that they've developed over the decades of having those people in the organization. But the other point is that organizations have to rethink their structure. So, if you look at a typical org chart, what you generally would have would be lots of little boxes, every box representing a full-time employee. Organizations can't assume that they can convince people to work for them for decades as a full-time employee. I mean, that paradigm is dying, and an organization can't unilaterally change it. What they can therefore do is reconsider what are the important functions that occur in the company for which we need full-time employees. I would say those are functions that are related to the non-negotiable. the brand,
mm,
IP,
mm,
customer products and services related to the customer. But there's lots of other factors that occur in the company that perhaps don't have to be served
mm,
with full-time employees or by a swiftly rotating employee workforce. But I certainly see the org chart of the future is going to have much more people coming in on a project basis
mhm,
or on a temp basis.
mm,
80% of the world's work is organized now in projects.
mm,
Well, we haven't yet re-architected how organizations respond
mm,
to a project-oriented way in which work happens.
mm,
So if you want to bring in someone on a 6-month basis, on a 12-month basis to fulfill a project, then you're aligning your talent strategy with your organizational process
mhm,
strategy. And then I think then you can have greater alignment. So part of the issues that companies face are less to do with how to retain talent and more to do with a discontinuity
mm,
between how they organize work and how people want to work.
Great response. Thank you. The next question is again on what the pandemic has done for the workplace. It seems that the entire paradigm of going to the office, doing managing by walking around, your coffee machine conversations, everything has changed. Do
Yep.
you see a return to status quo ante?
Never. I
Mm-hmm.
think that those days are gone forever, and we can't will them back either. And nor can we pay them back. In other words, well, we'll just pay people more, and then they'll work in this new manner. Because I survey, as part of my book, Next Generation Leadership, I survey Gen Ys, millennials, right? Who they compose 65% of the global workforce, and in 2 years they will compose 75% of the global workforce. And I asked them, what are the top 3 things that you're looking for in an employer? None of those had to do with like a raise or like a tangible benefit. It was intangible benefits, work-life balance. This is one big reason why I don't think we'll ever go back to the way things were. Culture, development opportunities. So we have to get used to a hybrid workforce in terms of how we work. Yes, I would certainly be the first to admit that there are good moments when you want people physically together, when you're having creative brainstorming conversations, perhaps, when you're having strategic conversations, when you're having town halls, doing alignment, things like that. But just mandating that people come into the office without specifying the function that you're asking for them on the day or days that they're in the office is a mistake. Because if you just say, for example, every Monday, that's everyone in the office day. Everyone comes in on Monday because that way we create an effective hybrid workforce. It doesn't create a hybrid effective workforce. All you're going to have are people sitting at their desk, tapping away at their laptops, not talking to each other, maybe with headsets in. Well, they could all be doing that at home. So what is the function that they're doing? Why are you asking them to come into the office? You can't just mandate they come into the office and expect that somehow you get greater collaboration or creativity.
Well said. And since you spoke about the hybrid workplace, how will leaders need to evolve their own leadership styles to manage hybrid workplaces?
Well, they certainly have to be much better at leading others in a remote manner. I think it's a mistake for leaders to say, I can only lead people if I'm seeing them face to face. That's simply an admission of their own weakness. It means they're unwilling to adapt. It doesn't mean it's not possible to manage someone virtually. And let's face it, we had 2-3 years where a lot of companies got very good about leading their people virtually. So I don't want to hear that it's impossible to lead people remotely. It is possible, but you have to lead differently. And this is part of the challenge. It has to do with a wider assumption, and that is that we become better leaders solely through experience. Experience certainly helps us be more effective as leaders, but it can also be a handicap if we conflate the way we wish to be led with how others wish to be led. Then you start to have conflict and ineffective leadership and things like resignation crisis, engagement crises, etc.
Very interesting. You also spoke very briefly about culture, so I want to talk to you about culture a little more. When you and I'm now talking of 4 decades ago when you were joined large companies, there's a certain culture that evolves because of the work practices, etc. In a hybrid workplace, how will culture evolve for large companies? And what are the changes that you see?
Well, I think this is a great example where, like work-life balance, we should define what we're talking about. So for me, the best definition, the most elegant definition I've ever heard of culture is shared behaviors.
Correct.
That's it, right? Just two words, shared behaviors. Now, even if we work remotely or in a hybrid manner, I still observe behaviors, even if I'm not in the same room with people, right? I can observe your behaviors. In any virtual meeting I join, I can observe behaviors. So that still occurs. Um, but it emphasizes the point that leaders have to walk the talk, and that it can't just be a communications device. In other words, when organizations, I think, don't do culture particularly well, they think of it solely as, well, we have to define the mission, define the values, and they create great, it's perfectly phrased, and they have lots of collateral, like it's, the values are painted on the wall in the office. But if those aren't lived, it doesn't matter. So the harder work, but the much more important work is, what is the organization that we need to be in order to succeed, win, and have fun together? And what are the behaviors, therefore, that we have to make sure that everyone is role modeling? And as importantly, how are we as leaders and role models in the company, how are we going to hold one another to account if those behaviors are not being lived? That's how culture is strengthened and adapted to suit the purpose of the day.
Terrific. You also speak about the future of capitalism. What are some of the macro trends you are observing?
Well, certainly a large part of it is a more integrated way in which society happens. Now, this has happened before. As I said, capitalism has a wonderful ability to reinvent itself. If you go back to the Renaissance in Europe, you had this interplay between commerce, arts, culture, public sector, faiths, society, all kind of working together. During the Industrial Revolution, those things were actually kind of pulled apart, and they no longer worked with each other. They actually just operated as almost siloed, autonomous estates. So what we're observing already is that these estates, as it were, are starting to become more integrated again. So issues that you would only probably talk about, for example, in a creative arts organization, you start to hear much more of in a commercial organization. Things like, we need to be more creative, we need more innovative, we need to be more adaptable, we need to be more inspirational, etc. Well, how do you do that? Well, if the estates work more together, then clearly there are lessons that the world of business can learn from the arts in terms of how we can work together in a way to maximize those capabilities. That's the subject of my next book, which is Sparking Success, is just that question. So I do think the purpose of work and the way work happens is evolving in much more of a this Renaissance manner, of this humanistic direction of travel.
Interesting. So let's now move to your books. Before I ask you about the books, I'm going to check. I mean, I'm assuming they're all available on Amazon.
Yes, they are. The Sparking Success launches on April 3rd, but will be available on any major retailer.
Okay. And therefore, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Adam Kingl's books, Next Generation Leadership, which is available now. And on the 3rd of April, go and check out Sparking Success. I'll go and check out the books myself. Tell me a little bit first about Next Generation Leadership, and then we'll talk about Sparking Success.
Sure. Well, Next Generation Leadership came out in 2020, so certainly not that long ago at all. But the research for it started 10 years before that, when I realized that the way in which different generations approached work and what they wanted from work was different. So then the question I asked myself, is it dramatically different? So, for example, with baby boomers and Gen X, are their paradigms different, but still sufficiently similar that they know kind of how to work together? And I think that's the case. But Gen Ys, millennials, seem to be so different that it was actually creating tensions and discontinuities and perturbations in the workforce. So I wanted to uncover what those paradigms were, A, so that we can better manage this huge generation, as I said, soon to be 75% of the global workforce. B, how do we better retain that top talent from that generation? C, if we understand those paradigms, that would allow us to peer into what the future of work will hold when Gen Ys assume leadership of their companies in their own right. So those are sort of the three questions that I wanted to answer with next generation leadership. I did
Right.
so by doing surveys of not just any random Gen Ys, but high potential Gen Ys. So top talent that their organization said these are our leaders of the future. They came from all over the world, 44 different countries. Then I did follow-up surveys to understand in more detail, anecdotally and qualitatively, why they gave certain answers on the survey. And then I followed up with interviews of like their HR departments, their line managers, senior executives, etc., to see where there were similarities and where there were tensions, in order to create this sort of template or workbook for how you might better lead Gen Y in the future to be a top recruiter of top talent, and how you might need to adapt how you manage work in order to be fit for the future.
Wonderful. And for the book that's coming out, what was been your hypothesis sparking success?
So for that one, it had to do with my I found two really interesting surveys that occurred in about 2015, and this created a question in my mind. Let me first, I'll explain the surveys. They were done simultaneously, but unbeknownst to one another, so they were completely separate. BCG did a study where they surveyed CEOs around the world, and they said, what are your top 3 priorities? And over 90% of CEOs said, in some way, creativity and innovation was a top 3 priority for them. At the same time, McKinsey did a survey, not of CEOs, but of rank and file employees all over the world, asking them about creativity and innovation in their organizations and how they assess their organization's creative and innovative performance.
Right.
And these people said, and again, huge percent, vast majority said, we're very bad at it. We're terrible at creativity and innovation. So isn't that interesting? Vast majority of CEOs say it's a top 3 priority. Vast majority of their employees say, but we're bad at it. So I'm not sure there's a bigger gap in the workforce today between the aspiration and the reality of a condition. And in this case, the condition was creativity and innovation. So then the question I had to ask myself is, well, how do we address it? As I said at the beginning, I used to come from the creative arts. That was my first career.
Yeah.
We had an abundance of creativity. Leaders knew how to lead creativity and innovation, and how to create processes, incentives, et cetera, that could thrive. Was there anything they were doing that was idiosyncratic to arts organizations, or could those leadership habits be applied in any industry, no matter how traditional that industry may be? So that's what the book sets out to explore and to create very simple leadership habits that any individual can do, no matter how junior or senior they are, in order to enhance the creative capacity of their team, of their department, or of their company.
Wonderful. And my last question to you, Adam, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation. Based on your own incredible journey of moving from so many different industries to writing your books, to the future of work, future of capitalism, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away?
Yeah, if I could paraphrase your question just slightly to say, this is a question I get a lot, which is, what are the 3 characteristics that leaders need to have today? One is humility. So this goes back to my earlier point. Don't conflate what you want from leaders with what others want from leaders. So be humble enough to find out what others seek from you, and be prepared to adapt to the individual and the occasion. 2 is creativity. We know creativity is a huge priority. Organizations need to adapt faster than ever before. But an organization cannot change unless its leaders are personally willing to change. And that requires leaders to be highly creative, highly innovative, highly adaptable. And the 3rd is humanity. So I think leaders have to be filled with humanity, these qualities of empathy, these qualities of understanding the individuals that look up to them as human beings. I'm not a big fan of the word human resources, because it implies, for example, that this pen is just as valuable of an asset to the organization as a colleague. So I think we have to sort of refocus our effort on seeing the human being behind the human resource.
Well said, well said. And on that note, Adam, and your 3 amazing characteristics that you spoke about for leaders, humility, creativity, and humanity and empathy, thank you so much for speaking to me about your own journey, Thank you for speaking to me about the future of work. I think I learned many, many new things from you today as you were talking about what you foresee as the work of the future. Thank you for speaking to me about your books, and wish you all the very best for the launch of Sparking Success on the 3rd of April. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.